It was an odd weekend for camping on October 8th, 2000, in Wallowa County, Oregon. The weather was cool and would soon be turning cold, especially in places like the Wollowa-Whitman National Forest. But that didn't deter 44-year-old Chris Northon and 38-year-old Liysa Northon from taking their 3-year-old son into the mountain for a weekend in the outdoors. Tragically, though 3 people drove into the mountains, only 2 would come back out alive. In the early dark of Saturday, October 9th, Chris Northon would be shot in the head by the woman he'd married just 4 years before. Welcome to Bitter Endings, a true crime podcast. I'm your host, J.R. Erickson. In Bitter Endings, I'll bring you stories of those taken too soon, the silent many who no longer have a voice through which to seek justice. Today's episode of the Bitter Endings podcast is sponsored by my latest fiction series. The Troubled Spirit series are paranormal murder mysteries that are inspired by true crime. You can find the series on Amazon.com in ebook, audiobook, paperback, and in Kindle Unlimited. Thanks for listening. Let me start by saying that I decided to cover this case because I recently listened to Ann Rule's audiobook on the crime called Heart Full of Lies, which was published in 2003, so about 3 years after the crime occurred. Ann Rule states at the beginning of the book that this was a difficult case to cover, filled with warring opinions between the family and friends of Liysa and Chris Northon. Liysa's friends and family insisted that she had suffered years of physical and emotional abuse at the hands of her husband. Those who knew and loved Chris refuted the claim, saying they'd never seen abuse and that Chris was a kind and gentle soul. The truth lived with only 2 people, and one of those people died on that chilly October night in 2000. In her book, Ann Rule tended toward those who believed Chris's side of the story. Ann presented Liysa as a dysfunctional person who exaggerated herself as the victim of her life, pointing first to physical abuse by her mother, and then weaving a tapestry of lies and exaggerations in which she was often wronged by those who claimed to love her. But I simply want to offer this as a disclaimer at the beginning that a good portion of this story does come from Ann Rule's book. There is another person who weighed in pretty heavily on Liysa's case, and we don't see his article appearing until 2011. His name is Rick Swart, and he will come up again. But he will present what he says is Liysa's side of the story. And again, I will get further into that. But before we get into the story of the murder of Chris Northon, I'd like to begin with the life of the man who was killed in October of 2000. Christopher James Northon was born to Jean and Dick Northon in Oakland on September 12, 1956. He had 2 sisters, Mary and Sally. Jean had struggled for years to have children, and she and her husband were overjoyed when she discovered she was pregnant with her oldest child, Chris. In 1968, the family moved to Bend, Oregon. They lived on a large ranch, and Jean thought of their life as idyllic. They skied, rode horses, and hiked. Chris was in Boy Scouts. He loved to ride horses and bulls. He baled hay and helped take care of the ranch. Chris's family described him as fearless. He was tall from a young age. He had blonde hair and blue eyes, and he was often a practical joker. Despite never having music lessons, Chris taught himself to play the piano, and he became very good at it, playing both jazz and classical music. Chris graduated from high school in 1974. He wasn't interested in college, but moved to California and mostly pursued his many interests, which included sailing, surfing, and hiking. He dated a variety of women over the years, and he amassed a great many friends who were loyal supporters even long after his death. In 1980, at the age of 24, Chris decided he wanted to fly. He started pursuing a career as a pilot. In 1980, he got his pilot's license. By the end of 1981, he had a commercial pilot's license, and he had become a flight instructor. He eventually flew charters for Resort Air in Bend, Oregon, and later he became a pilot for Hawaiian Airlines. Many of Chris's friends and family described him as highly independent. In her book on the case, Ann Rule painted the picture of Chris as a bachelor who dated women, but often not seriously. He did date several women for a period of years that he was quite close to and that he remained friends with long after their intimate relationships had ended. As an adult, Chris was strong, attractive, and athletic, and he was not necessarily interested in marriage or having children. Chris met Liysa King in Oahu, Hawaii in the mid-90s when he was living in a house with several of his pilot friends across the street from the home that Liysa shared with her young son. He soon started spending a great deal of time with the woman who would become his wife, he becoming her third husband, and also the woman who would eventually kill him. Before I get into that story, I want to take some time now to talk about Liysa. And again, much of this information comes from Ann Rule's book, which, according to Ann, was based on extensive interviews that she did about the case, as well as transcripts from the later trial. Liysa Ann DeWitt was born to Sharon and Waylon DeWitt in Silver City, New Mexico on March 10, 1962. The DeWitt family eventually relocated to Washington State. Liysa had a brother named John who was born on November 7, 1963, and was known to the family as Tor. Wayland was an educator and frequently traveled while Sharon stayed home with her children. Liysa was pretty and slender, with long blonde-brown hair and blue eyes. She loved the outdoors and often skied, hiked, and swam. Liysa would later tell those she was close to that her mother was abusive and that her mother had broken 26 bones in her body by the time Liysa was 16. In Rule's book, Ann would later say she was not able to find any evidence that Liysa had ever suffered a single broken bone in her youth, nor any proof that her mother had ever been abusive. Liysa attended Wallowa High School, where she was quite popular, graduating in 1979. She went to Oregon State University, where she stayed for 2 years. Liysa would later speak of an intense relationship she had during that time with a football player named Ray. She would tell the story that her and Ray were engaged to be married, and shortly before their planned wedding, he was killed in a car accident. Oddly, this was another story that Ann Rule seemed unable to corroborate in her book. Liysa longed to travel to exotic locations. She was an intelligent and artistic woman who wrote extensively, both journals as well as fictional stories and screenplays. Liysa's parents divorced, but Liysa remained especially close with her father. Liysa married her first husband in 1981. In Rule's book, Ann called him Kurt, and this is a pseudonym. Liysa was 19 when she got married to Kurt, who was 20. Kurt was a flutist and attended school in New York, and Liysa and Kurt would live there for a period of time. Liysa would later call the marriage a sham and claim that it had lasted for a very short amount of time. However, Liysa was with Kurt for 4 years and legally married to him for 6. While together, the couple eventually moved to Hawaii. It was during this time that Anne spoke about a disturbing pattern that began to appear in the stories she was hearing about Lisa's life from people who had formerly known her. Anne said that Kurt discovered that Lisa frequently lied to him about a range of things. He would later say that Lisa was manipulative and that she couldn't tell the truth. He also discovered that Lisa had cheated on him with multiple men. Lisa thrived in Hawaii. She became a talented bodyboarder. She loved the ocean and being in nature. Despite Lisa's surfer girl facade, there were cracks in the foundation of Lisa's personality, which Anne Rule wrote about extensively in Heart Full of Lies. I will highlight only a few of those, but a central theme running through was Lisa's tendency to twist the truth in a way that made her the victim. One of the stranger stories that Rule told was when Lisa claimed she was suffering from amnesia. After her marriage to Kurt ended, Lisa began seeing a man who Anne in the book called Tim. They dated for a period of time, and later Tim would tell Anne Rule about Lisa, quote, "I think she is such an adept liar that she actually believes her lies." In May 1986, Tim was driving Lisa to the airport when she started sobbing. Tim turned the car around and took Lisa home and put her to bed. She seemed catatonic. When she woke up, she was acting as if she were living in a different time. When Tim asked her what year it was, she said it was 1983. Lisa pretended to her then boyfriend that she couldn't remember him. He and his family were dumbfounded, and Tim's mother would even offer Lisa her home in Hawaii, in Oahu, as a place to stay while she recovered from her amnesia. However, months after Lisa had ended things with Tim and moved on with her own life, one of Tim's family members would discover a journal that had been buried at the house Lisa had been staying in during her recovery. The journal belonged to Lisa, and in it she had intricately planned feigning amnesia in order to end her relationship with Tim. This is a pretty excessive thing to do, and again points to an aspect of Lisa's grasp on reality that didn't quite align with the actual world. Amnesia is largely the stuff of soap operas and B-movies, and yet she fully embodied this claim for months. It wasn't a one-off lie to get out of a date. It was an ongoing lie that had to be told and retold as she lived in the home of the mother of the guy she'd formerly been in a serious relationship with. Lisa met her second husband, Don King. They would stay together for 9 years. He was tall, handsome, and a talented surf photographer. Lisa would learn the craft of surf photography from her second husband, and they would go on to do multiple film and photo book projects together. They would also have a son in 1991, Okai. Lisa was a loving mother who doted on her son. Lisa also had big dreams. She'd spent years envisioning a retreat center that she hoped to call Chrysalis, with locations in both Oregon and Hawaii. It was an idealistic dream, but one that seemed to create conflicts in her marriages, as, according to Anne Rule, Lisa put pressure on all of her husbands to purchase property so she could fulfill this dream. And although her second husband did purchase several properties while they were married, he was never willing to buy the large acreage that Lisa wanted in Oregon to have one of her retreat centers in that state. Again, her husband's, and I do mean husbands plural, unwillingness to help her fulfill these dreams did seem to become a running theme of resentment in Lisa's life. And Anne Rule wrote about this, again, extensively in the book. So if you are interested in a much deeper look into these things, you would want to pick up Heart Full of Lies by Ann Rule. But Ann essentially was painting a picture of Liysa as a woman who was never satisfied. She would pursue a person or a goal with tenacious energy, and then when she had married that person or had achieved some version of that goal, it would disappoint her and she would long for more. On the one hand, we see an image of Liysa, barefoot and beautiful, a talented photographer, a skilled writer, a loving mother, and a dear friend. On the other hand, there's another side that is portrayed, a person who stretched the truth, who fixated on people and then became quickly disillusioned with them, perhaps distorting her own disappointment in them to the point where she viewed their treatment of her as abuse or neglect. Eventually, Liysa grew increasingly unhappy in her marriage with Don, writing again and again in one of her journals, quote, "I hate my husband, I hate my husband, I hate my husband." As Liysa pulled away from Don, she attempted to reignite former romances, even claiming at one point that she had cancer, which appears again not to have been true. When Liysa met Chris Northon in the mid-90s, they were both successful. Liysa had made her mark as a surf photographer and was earning an upwards of $8,000 a month in her profession. Chris was a celebrated pilot for Hawaiian Airlines. When Liysa and Chris started dating, it appears she was still married to Don King. Although no one except the couple knows what their early months were like together, Rule quoted from multiple letters and journals that illuminated how insistent Liysa was on marrying Chris, and he, being a 40-something bachelor, was less interested in lifelong commitment. Eventually, Chris agreed to marry Liysa, and they were married in a moonlit beach ceremony in 1996, just 26 days after her divorce from Don King was finalized. When Chris and Liysa met, Chris already owned a home in Bend, Oregon, which again is where he had grown up. Liysa, on the other hand, owned the home in Oahu, Hawaii, that she had bought with her former husband, Don. So the couple, Chris and Liysa, would divide their time between Hawaii and the Pacific Northwest. The couple went on to have one son together, Dane. Both Liysa and Chris adored their son. In addition to Dane, Liysa's first child, Okai, lived primarily with them as well. It appears the honeymoon phase was relatively short-lived for Liysa and Chris. Within months of being married, Liysa started to degrade Chris to both her and his friends. Chris himself seemed distant or perhaps somewhat disinterested in Liysa. Rule went in depth on the accounts offered by Chris's friends of how Liysa belittled him in front of them. Chris, a person who rarely engaged in conflict, would often simply walk away when this began. However, Liysa also started to tell her own friends, family, and even women she met casually at the local pool in Hawaii that Chris was abusing her. She showed them bruises and claimed that Chris was a violent drunk and marijuana user. As mentioned before, this information largely comes from Ann Rule's book, an article written by journalist Rick Swart and printed in the Seattle Weekly in 2011, which again was over a decade after Chris died, would offer Liysa's side of the story. But let me offer a disclaimer. After the piece was printed in the Seattle Weekly, it was discovered that Rick Swart was actually engaged to Liysa Northon, who was still in prison at the time. And 2 months after the article was printed, Rick and Liysa would get married. In the Seattle Weekly article, Liysa alleged that Chris put his hands on her just months after they got married. She said he'd been drinking and they'd been arguing when he grabbed her neck and started to choke her. She said both she and Chris were horrified by what he'd done. She thought it was a one-time thing, but claimed it was only the beginning and it would continue 2 or 3 times a week until she killed him. Liysa said Chris hit her in the face, smashed her head against the wall, dragged her by her hair, and kicked her in the ribs. She said the boys learned to retreat to a back room so they didn't witness the violent abuse. Liysa also called the police on multiple occasions. The first time was in Bend, Oregon, but she said when police arrived, they laughed with Chris as if they were old friends and advised Liysa that the couple just needed counseling. In February of 1999, Liysa went to see a doctor who noticed a number of bruises and abrasions on her body. Liysa told the doctor that Chris, her husband, had put them there. Chris was subsequently arrested and charged with assault, but when it came time to testify against him, Liysa did not show up at court. Rule also mentioned these incidents in her true crime book, and I have to admit they felt vaguely brushed over, and this is one of the challenges I have with Ann Rule's theory that Liysa made up all the abuse. If Liysa were fabricating everything, why would she risk calling the police and revealing to Chris that she was presenting him as an abuser? And likewise, why wouldn't Chris be insisting that it wasn't true? Instead, he appears to have said on more than one occasion that he had issues with anger and simply avoided the accusations of abuse. Swart, in his article, said that Liysa claimed that Chris had long abused alcohol and drugs, including weed, cocaine, Vicodin, and the sleeping pill Restorol. Supposedly, in 2000, when their marriage was on the rocks, Liysa saw an upcoming October camping trip as an opportunity to address Chris's addiction issues and insist that he go to rehab. Let's rewind back now to the weekend that would shatter so many lives. It was October 8th in 2000 in Oregon. Golden and red trees, crisp mornings, and the beginning of the shift toward winter. 27 miles southwest of Enterprise, Oregon, lay the shady campground in the Wollowa-Whitman National Forest on the Lostine River. It's a beautiful place with soaring pines and fir trees divided by the sparkling water of the Lostine River. In the summer, it's a popular spot for tourists, but in the fall, when weather can quickly become volatile in the mountains, it's rare to see any campers in the area. Much was the case the weekend of October 8th, when Liysa, Chris, and Dane drove in 2 vehicles to the campground. Who planned the trip that fateful weekend is debatable. In Rule's book, she cited multiple witnesses who claimed that Liysa planned the camping trip at the last minute, and Chris was not enthused about the adventure. He'd just come off a long period of flying for Hawaiian Airlines and had plans to help paint a shed at his home in Bend, Oregon that weekend. Liysa, on the other hand, would say that Chris planned the trip. However, in later articles, such as Swart's 2011 article, he would state that Liysa claimed she thought that the trip would be a good time to confront Chris about his problems with drugs and alcohol, which again implies that Liysa planned the trip. There were no witnesses save Liysa and their 3-year-old, Dane, to what transpired at the campsite on the final day of Chris's life. On Monday, October 9th, Liysa arrived in Washington State, 4 hours from the campground, soaking wet at her friend's house, where her 8-year-old son, Okai, had spent the weekend to learn about stained glass. Liysa immediately started telling her friend a harrowing tale of escaping from her drunken, violent husband who had held a knife to their son Dane's throat, and that, frightened, she had taken Dane for a 20-minute drive before returning to the campground. After she returned, she confronted Chris about his drinking. According to Liysa, Chris, in a rage, choked her and tried to drown her. She claimed that she fled the campground after Chris had passed out in his sleeping bag, and that as she was running away from him in the darkness, she fired a shot towards the sleeping bag, but did not know if she'd hit him. Liysa's friend insisted that she go to the hospital, where several nurses and other medical staff would examine her injuries. It does not appear that Liysa's injuries were extensive when she arrived at the hospital, despite an apparent life-and-death fight. Nurses noted Liysa's black eye, as well as abrasions on her shoulder. Apparently, 17 injuries were documented at the hospital, which mostly included scrapes and bruises. Both hospital staff and law enforcement would say that Liysa seemed oddly calm and collected after the ordeal that she had supposedly been through. Her story also seemed not to make much sense, and she often evaded answering specific questions. Now, again, this could be because she had just gone through a traumatic ordeal, and it also could be because the story she was telling was not true, and it's difficult to answer specifically when you're making things up. Meanwhile, back in Wallowa County, Under Sheriff Rich Stein had been sent to the shady campground after police in Wallowa County were contacted about what had potentially taken place the night before. Stein found the campsite that Liysa and Chris had been staying at, and he could see a blue sleeping bag on the ground. As he approached, he noticed that there were tufts of blonde hair matted with red sticking out from the sleeping bag, but the sleeping bag was zipped so high he really could not see the person inside. He quickly discovered that the body of Chris Northon lay inside the bag. The campsite was in disarray, with a camp chair in the river and another lying on its side. There were marks in the sand along the river as if there had been a fight or struggle. There were also multiple partially empty liquor bottles. Rigor mortis had completely set in on Chris's body when the officer found him. The forensic team at the scene also noted that his forehead and face and body seemed to be covered in sand, and it appeared he had been killed by a gunshot wound to the head. Chris was completely naked in the sleeping bag, and his entire body was coated in sand. Postmortem would reveal that Chris had been shot in the temple, and death would have been immediate. Eventually, blood and urine tests would show that Chris did not have alcohol in his system. Other things that were noticed on Chris's body were bruises on top of his shoulder, on both of his knees, his shins, and a deep scratch on one of his toes. His hands and wrists were tucked up beneath his chin, almost touching. There were also odd marks on Chris's chest that looked somewhat like fingernail scratches, but more like burns. Liysa Northon was arrested the day that she appeared at the hospital with the story that she had shot at Chris. Detectives immediately began to piece together the evidence they found at the crime scene, as well as attempt to line this evidence up with Liysa's story about what had happened. When Chris's parents, Jean and Dick, were informed of their son's death, they were in shock. The death of their son was devastating enough, but that it came at the hands of his wife was almost unbearable. 2 memorial services were held in Chris's honor. The first was on October 17, 2000. Poster-sized pictures of Chris were set up as a remembrance and revealed happier times with Chris in his pilot uniform, and another image of Chris skiing with Dane on his back. Through tears, Chris's family and friends spoke of their dearly departed friend. Another memorial was held in Hawaii. Half of Chris's ashes were spread in the Oregon mountains, where he'd had so many good years with his parents and friends. The other half were taken to Hawaii. One of Chris's pilot friends took the ashes up in a plane to spread over the Hawaiian islands Chris had loved. Poor weather threatened to delay the release of Chris's ashes, but then an oncoming storm broke and a rainbow appeared. Beneath the plane, floating in the ocean, were many of Chris's friends and fellow pilots on surfboards. The ashes were released into the rainbow. a farewell that seemed almost as idyllic as so much of Chris's life had been. Liysa remained at the Union County Jail in LaGround, Oregon. She pleaded not guilty to murder charges but was denied bail. Liysa's murder trial began in July of 2001. She was represented by a seasoned attorney, Patrick Birmingham. Judge Philip Mendigiran oversaw the proceedings, and the case was prosecuted by Stephen Briggs of the State Attorney General's office. Chris's death was no ordinary murder, and the trial itself would prove to be equally filled with twists and turns, though in reality it would only last for a few days. On the one hand, friends and family of Liysa were lining up in support of her as a battered wife who'd killed her husband to protect herself. Though none of these people had seen Chris abuse his wife, they'd been seeing bruises and hearing Liysa's horror stories for years. Chris's family and friends adamantly disagreed, saying that Chris was not a violent person. And despite Liysa's claims of his drug and alcohol abuse, they also argued that he did not abuse any substances. The abuse claim was further complicated when law enforcement were unable to find any previous girlfriends of Chris who had ever been abused by him. Instead, they said he was gentle and tended to avoid conflict. The autopsy would further cast Liysa's story of the murder into shadow when the medical examiner found a large amount of Restorol, a sleeping pill, in Chris's blood. This was an amount large enough that Chris, had he not been shot, may have eventually died that night from ingesting it. It also implied that when Chris was murdered, he was in a deep sleep and possibly even in a coma. Another physical finding that supported this was that Chris had a full bladder at the time of his death, so full it would have been painful. It was clear that Chris had not relieved himself for an extensive period of time. Another aspect of the autopsy that didn't line up with Liysa's story was that there was no alcohol found in Chris's blood, despite Liysa's claims that he had been violently drunk the day that she killed him, and that he had attacked her and even held a knife to their child's throat. She said that he'd consumed a large amount of vodka. Again, there was no alcohol in Chris's blood, but furthermore, the alcohol bottles at the scene were not vodka. Law enforcement had found a mostly empty whiskey bottle and a bottle of Kahlua. Neither did investigators find any prescription bottles, despite the large quantity of sleeping pills in Chris's blood. Liysa told the story that the day that she shot Chris, so October 8th, that he'd held a knife to Dane's throat. And Liysa had taken Dane and gone for a 20-minute drive. And then she returned to the campsite and made dinner and confronted Chris about his alcohol and drug use, at which point he attacked her and tried to choke and drown her. Again, an oddity that both law enforcement and prosecutors focused on was if Chris had actually held a knife to their 3-year-old's throat, which again, everyone in Chris's life said he would never ever have done that. Why would she ever have returned to the scene? So much of her defense at the time and in the years since Chris died was that she was trying to protect her children. And yet, supposedly, after Chris had threatened to kill them and had held a knife to her son's throat, she took her 3-year-old son back to the campsite in a remote location with Chris. Other oddities in the autopsy were those 2 marks on Chris's chest that looked like burn marks. And this was important because investigators had discovered that the morning that Liysa showed up at her friend's house, she'd had a backpack in her possession. And in that backpack, there were 2 stun guns as well as handcuffs. And the marks on his chest appeared to have been made from stun guns. Other things that would potentially implicate Liysa in her husband's premeditated murder were her own writings. As I mentioned before, Liysa was a prolific writer who had penned many screenplays and stories. The concerning thing was the recurring plot that appeared in many of these stories. They portrayed an abused and fed-up wife murdering her husband. In one story, the wife shot her husband in the temple with a spear gun. One of these screenplays was nearly verbatim what had actually happened to Chris Northon. Again, this begs the question, was Liysa writing these stories as a sort of catharsis, as a way to deal with the helplessness of being an abused spouse? Or were they merely fantasies in which she was the ultimate victim and victor against a person she no longer wanted to be married to? A major discovery that happened right as the trial was starting was an anonymous phone call that came into the prosecutor's office reporting that one of Liysa's close friends was in possession of a laptop computer that Liysa had previously reported stolen. I'll mention that Anne Rule in her book reported extensively on this computer because apparently Liysa claimed her laptop, an additional computer, and a camera had been stolen from the home she shared with Chris in Bend, Oregon. A police report was filed, and I believe insurance reimbursed Liysa for these items. However, she was in a deep depression for a period of time because she had lost her writing. However, it came out during the anonymous call that these things had not been stolen after all. Instead, Liysa had given this laptop to her friend for safekeeping because apparently she was afraid that Chris's sister would steal these items while she was cleaning Chris's house in Bend. And again, this happened long before the murder. I'm not sure how long, but months before the murder. While incarcerated, Liysa reached out to this friend and insisted that she destroy the computer. The friend, who was an attorney, refused to do so. Law enforcement took possession of the laptop, and a person who did forensic work with computers through the FBI searched through files that Liysa believed she had deleted. Prosecutors learned that Liysa had been researching forensics, ballistics, and poisons months before Chris was murdered. There was also email correspondence in which Liysa was trying to get a gun silencer, and she spoke of planning a death to look like an accident. Also, in one of these email correspondence, Liysa mentioned that she thought drowning was the best way to kill Chris and have it look like an accident. This same friend who was in possession of the laptop told law enforcement that Liysa had asked her about getting poison to poison Chris. As the damaging information began to pile up about Liysa's guilt in Chris's premeditated murder, Liysa's attorneys advised her to take a plea deal in which she would confess to manslaughter through an Alfred plea. And this would include an agreed-upon sentence of 12 years. Liysa's attorneys simply did not feel that they could present Liysa as a battered woman based on all of the stories that they had heard, as well as evidence that investigators had found, implying she had been planning to kill her husband for quite some time. Liysa ended up taking the deal. At the end of Heart Full of Lies, Anne Rule outlined how she thought the murder of Chris Northon was committed, and I wanted to go through that scenario. Anne believed that Liysa had been planning the murder of Chris for months. Emails sent to her father implied that she wanted the death to look accidental, specifically like a drowning. Chris would not be an easy man to drown, as he was over 6 foot tall and over 200 pounds. This is where the sleeping pills and stun guns would be necessary to render Chris unconscious. Anne believes Liysa drugged Chris that day at the campground, and while he was still conscious but disoriented, she coaxed him into the river and attempted to drown him, possibly using the stun guns. Sand that was found in his wet, discarded clothes at the scene supported the premise that Chris was on the bottom of the river at some point. Anne believed that Liysa was having a hard time drowning Chris. Perhaps the water had even revived him, and somehow he made his way back to the shore, which is potentially when Liysa suffered the black eye. Liysa removed his clothes and helped him into his sleeping bag. She then zipped the sleeping bag up high. And I'll also mention here that Liysa did say that she had helped a naked Chris into his sleeping bag at some point during that weekend after he'd been drunk and violent with her. And then eventually she shoots him in the temple, and she stages the scene around the campsite so it appears there was a struggle. Liysa had claimed that Chris had attacked her, tried to drown her, and then passed out naked in his sleeping bag. She claimed that she shot at him in the dark while fleeing toward her vehicle with Dane in one arm. This story at its basic level feels contrived to me. If trying to escape, why shoot at him, knowing in all likelihood blindly shooting into the dark would merely result in him waking up and coming after you in a rage? Either you walk up and shoot him to ensure he can't follow and because you fear for your life, or you just pack up your kid and run. The shot at him thing rings even less true when you consider he was shot in the temple, a shot that essentially killed him on impact. If Liysa did in fact murder Chris Northon, what was her motive, if not out of fear for her life? Anne Rule, as well as those who prosecuted Liysa, pointed to a $300,000 life insurance policy on Chris, as well as sole ownership of the couple's property, which included real estate valued at over $1 million. Also, Liysa would then have sole custody of their son, Dane. And finally, airline pilot widow's benefits, which meant Liysa could fly for free. And although this may seem unimportant, it had actually been something that Liysa was quite preoccupied with earlier in her and Chris's relationship. So back to Rick Swartz's article, and again, this is the journalist who published an article in 2011 without actually admitting that he was engaged to Liysa when he wrote this article. In Swartz's article, he claims to debunk several of Anne Rule's statements in her book, citing that Anne primarily spoke to Chris's family and made little effort to get in touch with Liysa. He also mentioned the so-called motive that Rule presented for the murder, i.e. the life insurance and shared assets. He said not only was Liysa not in need financially, she had, according to Swartz, taken out a much larger life insurance policy on herself, including an additional $100,000 policy months before she shot Chris due to his increasingly violent behavior. According to Swartz, there were multiple people who argued that Liysa was not a sociopath, which, again, that was one of the implications in Anne's book. I don't know if she stated sociopath specifically, but she did state multiple personality disorders that she thought Liysa suffered from. So Swartz said there were multiple people who said Liysa was not a sociopath and that she had not fabricated her abuse, including a court-appointed psychiatrist. He also claimed that Liysa took a lie detector test regarding the night of the shooting, which she passed, and did not mention a lie detector test in her book. Swartz seemed convinced, largely at Liysa's insistence, that Liysa had been railroaded, that the police, the prosecutors, and the defense team had all been against her, and for whatever reason had not taken her claims of abuse seriously. Ultimately, Ann Rule's own opinion, too, was largely in that vein, which again causes one to wonder, why is that? If all of these people who are part of the justice system and are in the law enforcement profession feel strongly that Liysa had plotted and intended to kill Chris and that it was not because she was a battered wife, I have to wonder why then. That's always what's the motivation for all of these people to come to that conclusion. I can't help but wonder if they saw something in Liysa that made them question her claims, that made them suspect there was more beneath the surface than the woman she portrayed. It's hard in cases like this when so many of the facts are presented by two opposing sides. But here's the thing. Rick Swart was clearly on Liysa's side. He openly admitted to being enchanted by her when he was only 22 years old, which is when they originally met. And when he wrote the article, he was engaged to her. But why would Ann Rule choose the opposing side? What would she possibly have to gain by implying that Liysa's killing of Chris Northon was premeditated and linked to a lifetime of questionable behavior and choices? Ultimately, fabricating such claims could pretty quickly put an end to Rule's career if a wall of support rose up behind Liysa, insisting that she had been abused and that any person who stated otherwise was supporting a known wife beater and a drug user. And yet that didn't seem to happen. Liysa's own defense team encouraged her to make a plea deal, seemingly afraid that her own words would guarantee a much harsher punishment for the mother of two. In the months after her sentencing, Liysa would push to keep her sons with people she loved and trusted. Okai and eventually Dane would both move in with Don King, and he would adopt Dane as his own son. Liysa continued her fight from prison, focusing largely in the years after she was incarcerated on her attorneys and saying that they had poorly represented her and essentially pushed her into making a plea deal. She filed multiple complaints against her prior lawyer, Pat Birmingham, but those were eventually dismissed by the Oregon Bar Association. For a period of time, Liysa's name would drift out of the public eye until Ann Rule published her book about Liysa and Chris Northon in 2003. And again, the name of that book is Heart Full of Lies. Liysa was reportedly devastated by the book and essentially felt that Ann Rule's book did more damage to her than even the crime and the trial and the time in prison. For a period of time, Liysa's case, again, would largely drift out of public eye, although she did appeal for clemency and was denied. Her case would become a headliner in 2011 after Rick Swart wrote the piece that I've mentioned previously for Seattle Weekly. And essentially, not only did Rick Swart write his opinion of what actually happened largely through Liysa's retelling, but he also wrote a scathing critique of Ann Rule's book, alleging that it was filled with errors. Very shortly after Seattle Weekly printed the freelance piece by Rick, they had to print an addendum to the piece when they discovered that Rick was not an unbiased journalist reporting on a crime. He was engaged to Liysa. And in a strange sense, this development fell in line with Rule's portrayal of Liysa in Heart Full of Lies as a woman who could draw men to her in order to get what she wanted and needed. Swart was unapologetic when confronted about the article. He told Seattle Weekly when asked why he didn't disclose the conflict of interest, quote, "It's a freelance piece, first of all. I'm selling you a product, so it's not like you're my boss and you need to know my personal life. My background is in community newspapers where we write about people we know, people we have relationships with all the time. We don't have the luxury of big staffs, so we're not as able to have those arm-length relationships, I guess. I'm willing to have all this fall squarely on my shoulders." Liysa, in response to the outrage over Swart not admitting that he was her fiance, said, quote, "Nobody would have run the story when he told them he'd fallen in love with me, and the utter injustice that was done to me needed to be printed." In the Oregonian article, Ann Rule weighed in on the claims that Liysa and Rick had made about errors in the novel. She said, quote, "I certainly didn't make up anything. It was all in the files and the transcripts. I couldn't find any real indication that Liysa had been battered, not by Chris." Liysa's prior defense attorney also said in that article, quote, "I didn't find any real errors," referring to Ann Rule's book. Liysa's eldest son, Okai, then 20, offered his thoughts on his stepfather, Chris Northon. Okai said, quote, "Chris was a great guy in many aspects, a really good stepdad, and he was a lot of fun. Chris wasn't the saint portrayed in Ann Rule's book, and Liysa wasn't the satanic person, the terrible psychopath that Rule makes her out to be. He did, however, call the couple the two worst personalities to put together. He said their frequent arguments were frightening, and neither of them was willing to give in. He noted Liysa's petite size and Chris's much larger, stronger stature added to the fear when the two of them argued." In the same article, Liysa had this to say, "For a battered woman, the danger is always imminent, always. Oregon badly needs a self-defense law for battered women. Right now, they just expect you to die and not make a fuss." As conclusion to the Oregonian article, Richard Cockle asked Rick Swart if he was concerned about Chris's death, seeing as how he had married the woman who'd killed her former husband. Rick said, quote, "I don't beat women. If I do, she has my permission to shoot me." So a quick little bit of background. Then Liysa DeWitt and Rick Swart had actually met long before her time at Coffee Correctional Facility. According to a 2011 article by Richard Cockle in the Oregonian, the two met at Wallowa Lake 3 decades before when Liysa was only 17 and Rick was 22. Rick asked Liysa on a date, but she stood him up. Their lives took different trajectories until Liysa came into the spotlight for having murdered Chris. Rick Swart was the editor of the Wallowa County Chieftain Weekly newspaper and had printed articles about the murder and the trial, but he didn't realize Liysa was the woman at the heart of that case. He only made the connection after he read a copy of Ann Rule's book and recognized Liysa's photo. He wrote to her at the Coffee River Correctional Facility, and the rest for now is history. They fell in love and they got married in the facility, and when Liysa was released in 2012, a new husband and a new home awaited her. It's a bittersweet story and one that's harder to swallow because who really knows who the victim was when Chris Northon died? Was it Chris himself, the man who never would get his happy ending? Or was it Liysa, who, unlike most battered women, lived to tell the tale, marry again, and perhaps find happiness? On October 9th, 2012, Liysa Northon, at 50 years old, was released from the Coffee Creek Correctional Facility in Wilsonville. The woman, known as Surfer in prison, walked free 12 years to the day after shooting Chris Northon in the head. In an article printed in the Coos Bay, Oregon paper, The World, Chris's mother, Jean Northon, said, quote, "He was so loved by so many people. He was a wonderful person. I hate the idea that Liysa can come to Wallowa County and that she could come to our front door someday." In the same article, Rick Swartz said it didn't matter what had happened all those years ago. He said, quote, "She has done her time and she is going home. It's as simple as that." Multiple legal battles would arise between Rick Swartz and Ann Rule, and I'm not going to get into those here. As I mentioned before, Ann Rule passed away in 2015. Ann ends Heartful of Lies with a dialogue about personality disorders, and she speaks about the possibility of Liysa suffering from borderline personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder, and bipolar disorder. One of the challenges with this case is that domestic violence is a secret crime. Few men who hit their wives do it in front of others, which is why it's very possible that if Chris abused Liysa, no one ever saw it. At the same time, the secretive nature of domestic violence often extends to both parties. Few abused women are as vocal about the abuse as Liysa was. Does that mean it wasn't true? No, it doesn't. Liysa was a unique woman. She may have told many people because it was her personality to do so. She was clearly a woman with means, with skills, with support. So why didn't she leave if she was being beaten, if the kids were unsafe? Well, for the same reasons many women stay. Out of fear, out of codependence, out of the awareness of the potential loss of their child, the financial burden, the list goes on. In a way, Rule's portrayal of Liysa paints an image either of a sociopath who lied extensively throughout her life and then set up those same lies in order to murder her husband and get away with it by claiming she was a battered woman, or possibly a woman who embellished to such an extent that she became the woman who cried wolf. The lies she told before made her accusations of abuse suspect. That doesn't mean they weren't true. It's also possible that in Liysa's mind they were true. In all likelihood, the absolute truth is some shade of gray. Fights that turned physical, even if they were physical by both parties, will definitely leave a bigger impact on the partner who's 5'4" and 113 pounds. Again, one of the biggest issues I have with Liysa's story about the way the crime was committed is the claim that she saw the camping weekend as a chance to confront Chris about his addiction. Why on earth would anyone who fears for their life and the life of their 3-year-old child choose to bring up such a concern with a supposedly violent drunk in an isolated forest, far, far away from any help, any witnesses, any easy means of escape? There's so much about the story that doesn't ring true. Does that mean she wasn't abused? No, she may have been abused, and that abuse may be the reason she plotted and eventually did kill her husband. On some level, at the end of it all, Liysa pretty clearly murdered Chris in cold blood. It's highly likely she orchestrated the trip that weekend in order to do so, when we consider she had on hand a gun, stun guns, sleeping pills, and everything she would need to ensure he didn't walk out of those woods alive. Had he abused her and threatened her? It's possible. Maybe it even happened that weekend, as she claimed. But she also had a vehicle, money, family, weapons. Chris was comatose when she walked up, and with amazing precision for someone who said she barely looked at where she was shooting, unloaded a bullet into his brain, ending his once bright life forever. She ended his life. She ended her son's chance at a life with his father. And ultimately, she ended her own life with her children for the next 12 years. When she finally walked free, her kids were nearly grown up. And whatever her goal was for killing Chris in 2000, I suspect she was disappointed in the outcome on the other side. Today's episode is sponsored by the Troubled Spirit series. The Troubled Spirit series are a fictional paranormal murder mystery series inspired by true crimes. If you are interested in the novels, you can find them on Amazon by searching for Troubled Spirits, or you can find a link in the show notes. You can also listen to the previous episodes of the Bitter Endings podcast, which highlight the cases that have inspired the first two novels in the series. The first novel, Dark River Inn, was inspired by the case of Heather Teague, which is episode 18. And the second novel in the series, Helm House, was inspired by the true crime story of Joan Risch, which I covered in episode 24 on the podcast. Thank you again for listening, and have a safe day. If you have any comments or case suggestions, please send me an email at bitterendingspodcast@gmail.com. You can also find out all of the resources for this episode and read the show notes and more. Visit my website at www.bitterendingspod.com. You can also find me on Facebook at Bitter Endings Podcast.